Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Clarifying Catholicism. Ordinarily, we explore theological topics, but in this series, we investigate the writings of, in my opinion, the most important little-known philosopher of the 20th century, Xavier Zubiri. This is not a theological series at all whatsoever. However, if you want to do good theology, you'll need a good philosophical backbone first. So if you want to check out the rest of the episodes in this series, check the link in the description. Without further ado, on to the show. Here we are, the final episode of the series. This episode will serve a threefold purpose. The first will be to summarize the key problems of Western philosophy, many of which we've covered in the series. The second will be to argue that Zubiri's alternative is a viable alternative to the preceding philosophical systems. The third will be to illustrate how Zubiri's work is relevant to tackling a variety of issues from ethics to theology. But before we go any further, I'd like to thank a few people for making this series possible. First and foremost, thank you, Dr. Thomas Fowler, for not only translating Zubiri's Sentient Intelligence, and by extension, introducing this monumental philosopher to the English-speaking world, but for reviewing the script for this series and offering critiques of it. Dr. Fowler is the president of the Xavier Zubiri Foundation of North America, and you can find the foundation's work on zubiri.org. Second, I'd like to thank Marcos Ibarra Mendoza, a high school science teacher who introduced me to Zubiri. He also read over this script too. I'd also like to thank Jose Nunes, a good friend of mine who knew little to nothing about Zubiri, but took the time to listen to me read this entire script to him so I could make sure it was accessible for people with little training in philosophy. Finally, I'd like to thank my roommates for putting up with me constantly talking about being, reality, and truth, whether it was in the context of me picking their brains or if it was at a party or gathering in which I heard someone use the terms incorrectly. Now, let's revisit the preceding philosophies that Zubiri took issue with. Classical philosophy, beginning all the way back with Parmenides, identified being with reality. Basically, a thing can be defined by its real qualities. At first glance, that seems pretty obvious, but it would seem to imply that some qualities of the thing aren't real. This is because, according to the Greek philosophers, the reality of a thing isn't around us in the physical world, rather it is in the realm of the soul. Physical things around us can change, so we must look to the eternal realm of the soul to tell us what is real and what is illusory, since change is a property of the physical world. Our bodies are inherently limited and can often obscure the eternal and real characteristics of a thing by imposing temporal qualities on them. Hence, when people disagree on something, it is often because their bodies are either getting in the way of the soul's capacity to access reality, Platonism, or are not providing the soul with enough data to access reality, Aristotle. When the soul has accessed reality, something is considered true. So we end up with a few problems here. First of all, we assume that reality is beyond the physical world. That is a massive assumption that classical and scholastic philosophy take for granted. One of my philosophy professors in college once said that they should only ever appeal to God in a state of last resort, and right off the bat we have a fundamental appeal to the divine to answer a question of where reality is and how we can access it. Second of all, upon making this monumental assumption, we embrace an epistemological system that places way too much emphasis on the soul over the body. And this is where cracks really start to form. Thousands of years ago, the ancient Greeks believed that the universe was more or less a set of static elements that rearranged themselves for all of eternity. This additional huge assumption that the universe's laws and elements are static implies that the human body is subject to a closed set of elements, meaning the material world isn't going to change the way it operates. There are several problems with this. Thanks to modern physics and biology, we now know that not only are the universe's laws fluid, given how the universe we know today does not operate according to the same laws it did in its infancy following the Big Bang, but the changing laws of the universe have massive impacts on the way we perceive the world. Specifically, the theory of evolution affirms that the way cavemen thought at the dawn of humanity is different than the way we think today, thanks to neurological changes. Thus, not only are the universe's laws dynamic, but so is the way the mind responds to those laws. These false assumptions that the universe's laws and knowledge about those laws is static led to a great overemphasis on the soul rather than the body, and it led to an arrogance that certain cultures or certain religions were gifted with special access to truth. The Greeks called other cultures barbarians for not accessing truth the way they did, and medieval Catholics eagerly appropriated this model of a static universe to claim certain knowledge of things like ethics. Finally, something has to be said about the distinction between body and soul and essential versus non-essential characteristics of things. The Greeks and scholastics rather rigidly distinguished between functions of body and soul, the body basically becoming a delivery boy of confused content for the almighty soul to sort out. The soul would figure out what components of a thing were essential or real, like a tree's nature to grow, while the body imposed a non-essential characteristics of a thing, like a tree's color or weight. The problem is that modern science has shown us that things like color are just as real as things like leaves and branches, as they are composed of particles such as photons, which are tangible things. So the distinction between essential and non-essential qualities is quite muddled. Basically, thanks to ancient and medieval philosophy, we end up with a system that is too soul-dependent and relies on a static understanding of the universe. While modern philosophy claimed to reverse the problems, it arguably made the same mistakes and worsened them. It did make one crucial and productive change, which was changing the location of reality from beyond the physical world to inside the physical world. However, this change was, for all practical purposes, completely nullified by the distinction between the body and mind. Rather than the soul being the supreme organizer and determinant of reality, the mind was now in charge. Specifically, within the rationalist and early empiricist traditions, we end up with models that keep a static universe of which certain knowledge can be attained. This was arguably worse than the preceding model, though, since at least the ancients accepted the humbling idea that something extrinsic, something beyond the mind, determined reality. The modern philosophers believed that since the mind constructed reality, by deconstructing it, we could achieve enlightenment. Essentially, the moderns thought that by replacing the soul with the mind, we could correct for the mistakes of their predecessors, but in doing so, they opened the door for philosophy and ethics to move in a radically subjectivist and relativistic direction. It is quite apparent how a philosophical system that prioritizes the mind over the body neglects how physical things beyond the mind shape it over time. The post-Enlightenment skeptics understood this and attempted to, once again, divorce the mind from reality. Immanuel Kant famously did this by claiming we cannot know anything about reality other than the fact that it exists and impacts our perspective of reality. And while the mind for Kant was entirely distinct from reality, it was still able to hold certain knowledge about its scope. Kant's model is frequently compared to seeing the world through tinted glasses. You might be confined to seeing reality through the color of that lens, but you can still make certain statements about the shade of reality. Thus, even though Kant believed we are fundamentally separated from reality, we can still make certain statements about our version of reality. So we are still left with a static model of the universe. Friedrich Hegel and the German idealists were the first modern philosophers to embrace the notion that perhaps the universe's laws weren't so static. Maybe the way reality functions has changed over time. This, according to Zubiri, was a step in the right direction, but it was still too dependent upon what is inside the mind. For Hegel and his successors, the human mind shapes itself throughout history. There's an element of self-determination that humans as a species shape their own destinies, their own realities, an absolute consciousness that unfolds throughout history. So we've shed the flawed notion of a static universe, but we've arrived at a dynamic universe whose reality isn't shaped by things outside the mind, rather it is shaped by our minds themselves. This is unacceptable to Zubiri because, again, before we can even consciously think, from when we are still in the womb, our minds are still shaped by things that are extrinsic to us. Now, while critical of his predecessors, which you can read about in his Fundamental Problems of Western Metaphysics, Zubiri appreciates and borrows from their qualities. His sentient intelligence is an attempt to build a philosophical system that is dependent upon the real, meaning that which is outside the mind, without neglecting the mind's role in shaping reality. He embraces a dynamic universe that is understood by a dynamic mind without falling into an idealism or relativism. Finally, he seeks to reunite philosophy as a cornerstone for all other sciences. Since the 20th century's divide between continental and analytic schools led to philosophy's relegation as either existential self-reflection or the study of logic, respectively. Both styles severed philosophy from the hard sciences. Zubiri aimed at bridging that gap by creating a philosophy that is relevant to all sciences, a feat attempted by Aristotle, whom Zubiri is critical of, but admires. Zubiri builds on his predecessors by accepting Aristotle's emphasis on the real serving as the cornerstone of philosophy. He accepts René Descartes' location of reality as inside the mind, with some modifications. He accepts Immanuel Kant's distinction between reality and the content that feeds into our reality. He accepts Hegel's dynamic universe and embraces Martin Heidegger's idea of possibility forming the cornerstone for being and reason. Zubiri's synthesis of all Western philosophy is truly impressive and deserves intense study. Let's begin this summary of Zubiri's work with his rejection of the great underlying problem that has plagued all of Western metaphysics, the identification of reality with being. Reality and being are distinct things that cannot be confused with each other. Reality is formalized content, meaning it exists inside the mind but is at the mercy of extrinsic real content to shape it. Thus, Zubiri's philosophy is realist, since the content is extrinsic to the mind, but we are immersed in reality rather than divorced from it. This location of reality within the mind that is shaped by extrinsic content and the body is the basis for Zubiri's radical body-soul unity, which is never fully realized in Western metaphysics, despite the best efforts of philosophers like Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. This unification between body and mind, or body and soul, is indeed radical, because unlike any other major Western philosopher, Zubiri does not ascribe certain functions to the body and others to the soul or mind. Every sense, whether that be sight, touch, taste, smell, sound, sense of direction, sense of balance, sense of temperature, every single one of those is a physical sense. There is no strict division that some senses are physical and others are just psychological or spiritual. All senses are physical. The body and mind are radically unified. Modern science would agree with this assessment, as even things like pleasures, pains, and desires can be explained by chemical balances in the brain, which are physical processes. Truth, therefore, ceases to be an agreement between our experiences and some mystical reality that is beyond the physical world. It is instead the result of the intellective process in actualizing reality. Truth isn't something we reach for. Rather, it is something produced by our intellective search. It is something that takes hold of us as we strive to exercise our intelligence. Think of it like this. When you're doing push-ups, you're exercising your biceps. An adjective to describe someone's arms as they do 100 push-ups is strong. Likewise, when you are solving a difficult mathematical equation, you are exercising your intelligence. An adjective to describe someone's intellect as they solve 100 equations is true. Truth, though it describes the quality of our intelligence, isn't determined by us, as skeptics like Nietzsche would say. For it is only once we've been provided with adequate data and experiences, things which come from real content, that we are satisfied and thus participating in truth. Ultimately, everyone has their own reality, but given enough impressions of content, those realities will intersect, and a sign of that intersection is intellectual alignment. That signifies the participation of truth by both parties. This notion that people have different realities that sometimes intersect and sometimes don't contradicts the idea of a static universe. Zubiri embraces this, though, Having been educated in modern physics, mathematics, biology, and chemistry, he appreciates the idea of a dynamic universe whose laws change over time, whether that be because of evolution or because the universe is gradually pulling itself apart. This dynamic universe model, which comes from German idealism, is kept in check by Zubiri's realism, though, since once again, our minds are not the ultimate determinants of how reality is organized. Rather, the real content forces our minds to respond in a certain way given enough impressions. A thing's being, which is what it is, its definition, is not something we appeal to metaphysical universals for. It is a thing's immanent relationship with other things. I do not define this cup as a cup because it reflects universal cupness. I define it as a cup because of the way it interacts with things around it, because of the way it fits into the constellation of all other things in reality. Being, therefore, is not about appealing to static universals, rather it is about exploring all possible relationships a thing can have with other things. This is a masterful integration of Heideggerian metaphysics into a realist philosophy. So, Zubiri's philosophy accounts for a universe that is both dynamic and reliant on the real. It accounts for what the empirical sciences have told us about how the laws of physics have changed over time. It incorporates evolutionary theory into philosophy. It integrates neuroscience to tear down the distinctions between physical and so-called non-physical senses. Now, Will, I hear you say, isn't this channel supposed to be about Catholicism? Yes. Shouldn't you be focused on theology? Well, you can't exactly do theology without a good philosophical framework. The fact is that before we even try to understand God, we must understand the intellective process that allows for us to understand anything to begin with. The earliest Christians were largely influenced by Platonism, and when you read the Church Fathers, you can tell that most of their language uses Platonic terms and ideas. During the second millennium of Christianity, there was a radical and controversial at the time shift to Aristotelian terms and ideas to describe theology. This was spearheaded by Thomas Aquinas and theologians who saw Platonism as outdated and inadequate to accurately describe not only theology but all the sciences. So for a little less than 1,000 years, the church was dominated by Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics. They dominated theology until the mid-20th century when the church became open-minded to modern philosophy. This led to much theological infighting in the church, which, in my opinion, has resulted in a potentially devastating divide. On the one hand, we have theologians who embrace modern philosophy, especially existentialism and Marxism. Many of them have eroded the church's emphasis on tradition and morality. Modern philosophy's emphasis on self-determination and independence has shifted the church's focus from proper moral formation to laid-back hippie religions, where anything goes. And you can see that in the percentage of people who identify as culturally Catholic in America, yet heartily agree with the church's moral teachings. On the other side, we have theologians who are clinging to Aristotelian-Thomistic philosophy. They believe that the acceptance of any modern philosophy was a mistake, and the only way to steer the ship on its course is to double down on the older paradigm. I personally believe that both of these models are not only insufficient, but they each pose a grave danger to the church's mission. Particularly, I believe that Zubiri's work has aptly demonstrated that Aristotelian-Thomistic metaphysics are no longer a sustainable backbone for theology. Essentially, it's time for the church to move on from a sola-Thomistic focus. Aristotelian-Thomistic metaphysics make too many assumptions about how the world functions. They fail to account for a dynamic universe, and their overemphasis on the soul threatens to upend the body-soul unity that Christians profess exists. Just as Platonism needed to be replaced by Aristotelianism at the beginning of the second millennium, I believe that Aristotelianism and Thomism are no longer sufficient to account for what science tells us about biology, physics, chemistry, and mathematics. We need to shift to a new paradigm, or else the divide between philosophy and the hard sciences will continue to bleed into a divide between theology and the hard sciences. What does a theology of Xavier Zubiri look like, though? First of all, I believe that Zubiri's emphasis on the radical unity between body and soul is far more compatible with the Christian notion of a bodily resurrection. In fact, the idea that our souls will be reunited with their bodies, as well as the notion that God could become human, bothered Greek philosophers so much that this topic took up the focus of pretty much every early church council. While Thomas Aquinas argues that the body and soul are in their most natural state when they are united, I'd argue that he makes this argument rather clumsily and begins with an assumption from Revelation. It's quite clear, though, that for Aristotle, even though the body and soul desire unity, the soul is so incredibly powerful over the body that it's almost awkward that you'd say a perfect state of eternity would involve any unity between them. Along those lines, Zubiri's unification of the senses as all physical, rather than some being physical and some being spiritual, stresses how all of our senses, not just our intellective ones, are sacred. Again, early Christians, especially Stoic ones, practiced mortification of the flesh. And while that has its purpose, I think that the divide between physical and intellective sensation from Thomism has led to an overemphasis on Catholicism's intellectual side. I meet many young Catholics who, rather than appreciate the beauty of the world through sensation, focus too much on overanalyzing the world and memorizing lists of doctrines and arguments. They behave as if conformity to God's laws is an intellectual experience. Instead, I prefer the Franciscan approach of appreciating God in all senses, not just the so-called intellective ones. A theology that claims the body is a temple functions better, in my opinion, if the so-called intellective senses are deemed just as physical as my sense of sight, touch, smell, etc. This would also alleviate the scandal of Jesus Christ becoming human, which the Muslims, who were inspired by Aristotle, took great issue with. Often I've heard historians and theologians claim that the Second Vatican Council shifted the Church from having a vertical theology to a horizontal one, meaning old school theology was focused on establishing a precise set of rigid rules to be followed, whereas more recent theology focuses on the individual's experience of God in their culture or context. I think that Zubiri's definition of truth, which is that truth is not something to be grasped, but is instead something that takes hold of us, fits in with the Council's mission very snugly. For it is possible for every person to experience God in the process of participating in truth, rather than by memorizing lists of rules. Again, considering that truth is something we produce, rather than a thing we reach for, de-emphasizes the intellectual aspects to Catholicism, which is a good thing considering not everyone has a time to read every single doctrine. Encounter with God is meant to be a personal experience mediated by the Church, not a rigid path to God dictated by the Church. A horizontal theology needs to rely upon a model of reality and truth that is fundamentally dynamic, not overly rigid. This, of course, has vast implications in a multicultural world, for it broadens the way people can encounter God. The early Christians had a great appreciation for the role God played in other religions. You can hear about that in my series on No Salvation Outside the Church. A lot of that, in my opinion, was lost in medieval theology, once it had been boldly assumed that everyone in the world had heard the gospel. That assumption, especially with the discovery of the New World, has proven quite false, and theologians scrambled to figure out what the role of people like Native Americans was in salvation history. The idea that all people produce truth, regardless of context or creed, broadens the capacity for non-Christians to receive grace from God. This is very important in a multicultural world. Speaking of which, this notion that reality and truth are not static but dynamic helps answer some questions about God's activities throughout human history. When you take a look at the Old Testament's laws and compare it to those of the New Testament's, you get seemingly very different theologies. Furthermore, it's a fair question to ask why God would behave so inhumanely or provide us with commandments that he had planned on changing anyways somewhere down the line. If truth in particular, though, is the dynamic unfolding of the intellective process throughout history, though, then God is allowed to change his laws so long as they contribute to the grander intellective activity of the human race. In simple terms, a good God, like a loving parent, will not govern his children with the same laws when they are infants than he will when they are teenagers. Thus, God's laws can change whilst staying true, as Zubiri defines truth as intellective actualization of reality. On that topic, Zubiri's definition of truth has vast consequences on biblical scholarship. In fact, it's usually the topic of biblical historicity that gets me into discussions of Zubiri with my friends and peers. Most modern biblical scholars agree that Adam, Eve, Abraham, Moses, and others were mythical and legendary characters. A common objection to this story would be that if they weren't real, then their stories wouldn't be true. This is a humongous mistake, though. Truth and reality are not the same. Reality is formalized content, and truth is intellective actualization of that content. Neither of those definitions demand that something be historical to be true. Truth is all about proper intellective response, formation, and development, just as a child is raised with fairy tales because he or she cannot distinguish between historical and fictional events. God, being a good and loving father, communicated to his people through myths and legends until they were mature enough to come face to face with his historical incarnation, Jesus Christ. But God's incarnation did not end with the death of Jesus. The incarnation continues to dwell in the church via the Eucharist, and the persistence of the Eucharist throughout the history of the church ensures God's presence with us throughout history, as his laws are realized and developed by the church. We did not achieve peak spiritual maturity during the lifetime of Christ. We kind of crucified the guy. We had and still have a lot of work to do in preparing the kingdom of God. Speaking of truth, Zubiri's ideas are relevant to ethics. Particularly, questions like what is a lie are pretty relevant. Responding with truth is what is real is not valid. Rather, truth as intellective actualization of reality ensures that we pay more attention to the effect words have on others and their intellective formation than any literal meaning. Grandma asking you, "Do you like the pink bunny sweater I knitted for you?" is her actually asking if you appreciate her work. Likewise, the Nazi asking, "Are there any Jews in your house?" is actually them asking, "Will you comply with me in killing Jews?" Essentially, when someone asks you a question, you can pay attention to the literal words, or you can dig deeper into what they are trying to achieve and give them what they deserve. According to the Zubirian reading of truth, truth is more complex and diverse than a series of literal questions. There are a myriad of other ways Zubiri's philosophy is compatible with theology. His definition of actuality as the formation of content into a person's reality, rather than something potential becoming actualized, is very compatible with Eucharistic theology, which states that a person's reception of the Eucharist depends on their acceptance of Christ. In Zubirian terms, the Eucharist is only the body of Christ if the receiver has received Christ into their life. Thus, the Eucharist takes on a much more personal role, as its consecration is not complete without the individual's acceptance of Christ into their lives. Zubiri's emphasis on possibility as the determinant of being means that things like freedom of speech and expression should be emphasized. Possibility's role as the cornerstone of reason, whilst always being incomplete, is a perfect demonstration of God's allowance of imperfection to lead to goodness, as we choose to love or reject God. Finally, Zubiri's philosophy greatly contributes to what theologians call a theology of the gift. Reality gives itself to us without expecting anything in return. No matter what we say, do, or think, real content impresses itself upon us. It gives itself to us, and nothing we can do can add or detract from it. Life, particularly human intelligence, is a sheer product of love. And just as we are given reality with no expectation of anything in return, we too can participate in creatively giving to others. Whether it be a physical gift, like a card to a friend, or the gift of listening to someone in need. We can contribute to the formation of other people's realities, expecting nothing in return. Hence, by loving each other, we participate in the great giving process that God himself initiated. This ultimately culminates in the creation of new life, something that only one man and one woman can accomplish. And that is exactly what my next series will be about. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.